We'll move forward into chapter 20, section 2, which is basically about how some of the European entities, such as the English, the French, the Dutch, start to create colonies in what is North America. And we're going to start with how those groups had explorers who kind of moved into the region and started to discover different areas and waterways. Starting with the French, establishing what was called New France, you had an explorer named Giovanni di Verrazzano. He was an Italian, but he sailed for the French, and he discovered New York Harbor, so started to make some claims there for the French. Then you have Jacques Cartier, also a sole Frenchman. He named the St. Lawrence River and then later Montreal. So on the map here, we've got a couple of things to take a look at. When you're looking at St. Lawrence River, that's right in here. Okay, Montreal region. These are all areas up in here where, of course, they were first discovered by the French in this part of North America. Then what ends up happening is we have Samuel de Champlain founding the area of Quebec in 1608. This is a major foundation here for the French in Canada. Quebec became the headquarters of French North American colonies, and then this became a region known as New France. Basically, when you're thinking of New France, you're thinking of the French colonies of North America. Now, some other key explorers here would be Marquette and Joliet. They explored some of the Great Lakes region and the upper Mississippi River Valley areas. So that would be kind of up in this region here. Okay, so Ohio Valley, what the modern day Midwest would be, and of course, all throughout here in the Great Lakes region. Okay, next we're going to take a look at Sieur de la Salle, who explored the lower Mississippi and then named this region Louisiana after the French king Louis XIV at the time. So that would be down in this region here of New Orleans. So the southern Mississippi River region right down in here. So all of this area in orange, this lightish yellow, orangish color, is primarily French claimed lands. Okay, eventually what the French were looking to do is create a trading empire. And by 1760, the French population in New France was still pretty small, only about 65,000 people. The main economic activity for the French was the fur trade. And what they were generally trading were beaver fur. One of the things that you have to really understand about the French holdings in North America is that really they were mostly there as priests trying to create converts or as fur trappers. They really didn't have a strong desire to start families, set up towns. The French were really here for more economic reasons rather than to pursue creating a long-standing settlement. So they didn't pose as large of a threat to native populations because actually for the natives, knowing that the French were mostly males, not bringing family, not bringing children, not bringing women, one of the things you have to understand is that to the natives, when they look at only men, they see this as most likely an economic activity in which they can also benefit. So the French and the natives established fairly good relationships based on the fur trade. Now, the English, on the other hand, had a little bit of a different situation. The English were looking to settle and stay. So they posed, in my opinion, the bigger threat to Native American society and culture. This starts with the settlement of Jamestown. Jamestown colony is founded by the English in 1607. The early settlers there from England did not prosper. Many of them died of hunger, disease, or in battles with Native Americans. They were really more concerned with trying to find gold than doing the necessary work. Unfortunately, on this east coast of North America, there just isn't that much gold to be had at that time. Their problem was that they really didn't understand how to farm and how to hunt the land yet. So they needed to rely on some native intervention, which would come a little bit later. Eventually, they did create a foothold in North America, and the big cash crop that they started to produce was tobacco. They learned how to cultivate tobacco from native tribes that were helpful to them, and tobacco at this time was a very hot commodity back in Europe. The next group that we'll take a look at from England are the Puritans, okay? The Puritans create what we know as of New England in that region today. The Pilgrims are a group that come over in 1620. They're from England. They founded what was known as a second British colony at Plymouth, Massachusetts, and they sought religious freedom from the English church. That was their goal. They were being rather persecuted for their beliefs that they wanted to purify basically the Anglican Church of any Catholic practice. And that's where the Puritans also come into play. The Puritans, about 10 years after the Pilgrims, they sought religious freedom from the Anglican Church as well by founding a colony at Massachusetts Bay. So these are some of the early foundational platforms that the English utilized to create a strong foothold in the United States region that we call today. Now, capital C, we're going to move to the Dutch. So if you go look at the map here, you see that eventually the English get this coastline here, and they also have the region of Newfoundland up in here. So they're kind of on the outskirts of where, of course, the French were. And then eventually you also have up here the English taking this region as well. Okay, and the Dutch would come into these regions as well here, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So when you think about the Dutch, they create what's called New Netherlands. Henry Hudson was a famous Dutch sailor. He was searching for a northwest sea route to Asia. So if you look at the map, what Hudson's trying to do is he's trying to get through up here and find a way to Asia. So instead of going down all the way past the southern tip of South America, he wants to come and navigate through here. Really, though, it's not very successful. A lot of the water there is frozen. So he didn't find that route, but he did explore 3 waterways that would be named after him later: the Hudson River, Hudson Bay, and also Hudson Strait, pretty popular in the New York, Canada region there. The Dutch also claimed lands near these waterways and established a fur trade with the Iroquois tribes there. And then what they called this land is New Netherland. These are Dutch holdings that they held in North America. And we'd also like to talk about the Caribbean. These groups also competed for land in the Caribbean. For example, the French created colonies in Haiti, Guadeloupe, and Martinique. The English had Barbados and Jamaica, and the Dutch had the Antilles, the Greater and Lesser Antilles, and the island of Aruba. Now, on these islands, what these European groups would do is they would build large cotton and sugar plantations in which they would use local natives as slave labor and then eventually African slaves as well. This led to a rivalry, a competition between these several groups, and we led to wars and battles for colonial supremacy between France, England, and of course the Dutch Netherlands. The English start by defeating the Dutch. They send over who was known as the Duke of York. He was the brother of the English king at the time, King Charles II. He was responsible for pushing the Dutch out of New Netherland and then renaming it New York. So that would be taking place in this region right in here. Okay, right in this region here, pushing the Dutch out of that region and then taking that over. Now, one thing that I want to say is that by 1750, about 1.2 million English settlers lived in the 13 colonies from Maine down to Georgia. So the population was really starting to grow in the 1700s of English coming over to the modern day United States region or of North America. Then England and France are going to go to war. And this one was a little bit bigger because this series of wars was going on both in Europe and in the Americas. So the English would push further into the frontier until they eventually came into conflict with the French. And you can sort of see how that takes place here. You see the French here, and you've got the English. So as they start to push west, they're going to come into conflict with, of course, French fur trappers, traders, and some settlers in those regions. Okay, so what we want to take a look at is the major conflict known as the French and Indian War. It's a war between, of course, the English and the French, and it became part of what's known as the 7 Years' War, which is what it was called in Europe. Now, the natives allied on both sides, but mostly they were on the side of the French. So when you look at the name of this war, it's basically from an English standpoint because they won the war. So they're calling it, okay, England versus the French and the Indians. Okay, so they're saying the French and their Native American allies. The British Army defeated the French in this part of the world in 1763, and this basically gave England control over the eastern half of North America. So if you look on the map here, you can see that in 1763, when they win this war, England controls all of the purple here. Okay, the 13 colonies were in this region here, and then this was all English territory as well. You still have Spain dominating the south and western region here, and a little bit of influence down in Florida and in Cuba, down into the Caribbean region here, with the French still having some stronghold in Haiti. So you can see that The map is changing from the mid 1700s on, and the English come to dominate, and they also have a little bit of influence coming into play from the Spanish. Okay, we're going to take a look at natives because really all of this land was inhabited by natives first. And so we're going to take a look at how this strained the relationship between the settlers and the Native Americans. I would say overall, the French and Dutch settlers developed a very cooperative relationship with natives. This was due to what we call the mutual benefits of the fur trade. It's actually called the middle ground. Europeans would trade things like glass, cookware, metalware, weapons, tools to natives in exchange for beaver fur. And so this was the middle ground that was created because both sides benefited from this trade. This was mostly done by the French and the Dutch. The English, they would also trade, but they didn't really want to trade their items to natives. So their trade was a little bit of a lesser scale, and they actually used warfare to take over native lands instead of diplomacy. So the English had more disputes over land and religion. They wanted to actually populate the American colonies, and this meant that they had to push native peoples off of their homelands. English settlers considered the natives heathens without faith. Obviously, Native Americans don't generally practice Christianity, so English had kind of put together a goal of trying to Christianize and assimilate Native American peoples into English, British, / eventually early American culture. Now, eventually this is going to lead to warfare. One of the first strikes is in 1622. The Powhatan tribe on the eastern coast attacked colonial villages around the area of Jamestown and actually killed about 350 settlers. The colonists would eventually strike back and kill hundreds of Powhatan peoples as well. And so now you have kind of large-scale war starting to pop up. One of the more famous wars that took place was called King Phillips War. King Phillips War was led by a native leader named Metacom. He was the son of Massasoit, on the eastern coast. And he was called King Philip because he looked like the Spanish king at the time, which was King Philip II. Now, he was a native ruler. He led an attack on colonial villages throughout Massachusetts starting in 1675. He actually had a lot of early success, but eventually the colonists rallied and defeated his group after 1 year of total fighting. Then I would say what really kicks into play here is the spread of disease. Eventually, smallpox becomes the main killer of natives, and the British are known to have used infected blankets with smallpox and systematically took blankets off of Native Americans who had died from the smallpox and then placed them on other Native Americans, telling them that this would be used to stay warm to try and get healthy. But there were some documents that prove that some of the authority figures in the British Army knew that this could eventually spread the smallpox disease. So it's kind of one of the first documented cases of chemical, biological warfare and sort of an act of genocide in this case. Thank you.